us off with a word of thanks for the week. First off, for the invitation to be here, and I know that I heard a lot about the excitement. This was your first moment to be able to have somebody in besides Andrew and Jason in a meeting like this, and I'm excited to be a part of that. I'm so grateful for the confidence of the elders in me to deliver these lessons. And it's been good to get to know you. Some I have known off and on for a while, but others I have not, and it's been good to see you and to meet you. And especially good to be back with Andrew and Jason. We spent a little time together, and then COVID hit, and hadn't really seen each other for probably about 2 years or close to that. So it's good to be back with them, and just grateful for the week. David suffered what had to be just the worst kind of betrayal. He is betrayed by his own son, Absalom. And in that story, David leaves Jerusalem, and he even crosses the Jordan to preserve his own life. And it's in that context that David's army is pursuing Absalom. And in 2 Samuel 18, starting in verse 28, we read about the report that comes back to David from the army's pursuit. Read that with me, 2 Samuel 18 in verse 28. Then Ahimaaz cried out to the king, "All is well." And he bowed before the king with his face to the earth and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who's delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." And the king said, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I do not know what it was." And the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. And behold, the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, "Good news for my lord the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you." And the king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" And the Cushite said, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man." Can you imagine having to give orders to an army to pursue your own son? And then have to hear the report that your son is dead because of his rebellion and his threat on your throne. We don't have to wonder what David thought or his emotions, because it's recorded for us in the very next verse. And the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." There's a good chance that there are some of you who have wept over a child very similarly. Parenting is a tough job. I always think it's funny that new parents are so excited because babies are fun. And toddlers challenge you a little bit. When you get to teenagers, it's way different. It's hard. And it's painful sometimes, because sometimes those babies grow up to be teenagers and young adults that spiritually lose their way. And when that happens, it breaks our hearts, similar to what David expressed here. Maybe they're immersed in the world with its lust, or with drugs, or the lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh. Maybe they're good kids, but they've just followed after other forms of doctrine. Whatever it is, I can tell you there is no greater heartache than when your child ignores what you have taught them from a young age and forsakes that altogether. And when you find yourself as a parent in that situation, it's very easy to ask questions like, well, where did I go wrong? What did I do? In fact, I've had parents come and sit down with me and talk about their children. What more could have I done? What have I done? Where did I go wrong? What happened here? I think part of that, by the way, is our misunderstanding of Proverbs 22 and verse 6. It says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. And we read that and we think, well, if we've done our job, our children will never depart from the way of truth. The problem with that is that your children still have free moral agency. They still have the ability to choose between good and evil, just like you do. God allows them to do that. And think about this, by the way. God is our Father, and we still choose the wrong path. Does that mean He's a failure? We've seen this week in our text the story of the prodigal son and a child who rejects what Jesus presents as the perfect parent. Wise, loving, merciful, and yet that child still strayed. In fact, what we've noticed is both children strayed. So tonight, as we wrap up, and as I've held these lessons at other places, it's always been important to have this lesson for parents. Because the question often comes up, well, what do you do if you're the parent of the reckless child? How do you handle that? So tonight I just want to give you 5 things. They're pretty simple. And then we'll be done in our time together. And the first of those that I think is really important is to remember who the enemy is. There is a big battle that is waged daily, moment by moment. Paul described in Ephesians 6 and verse 12 this way. He said, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, or against rulers, against authorities, against cosmic powers over the present darkness, against spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. That phrase alone about spiritual forces of evil kind of always scares me. Think about that. Spiritual forces of evil. Peter describes the devil as a lion in 1 Peter 5 and verse 8, but not just any lion, a lion that is stalking and prowling as a lion, seeking to devour people. Satan is trying to devour our children. How scary is that, by the way? And in Luke 15, what you have in that young son when he asked for his possessions is that he has been tempted to follow after the things of this world that are listed in 1 John chapter 2. The things that he sees, the things that he lusts with his flesh, the appetite, the pursuit of his independence and his pride. His lustful eyes saw the inheritance that could be his, that he was owed, and he wanted it right now. And by receiving it, he could leave home and he could satisfy his flesh and he could do whatever he wanted because no longer would he be under the watchful eye of his father. Be no more rules or restrictions. He also gave into his pride because he didn't need his father anymore. It just wasn't necessary. And all that happened because Satan tempted him in those ways. Those are the same ways that we see Satan tempting back in the garden in Genesis chapter 3. It's the same way we see him tempting Jesus. We see those things over and over and over again. Let me say something here. Sometimes as parents, we become concerned about a lot of things like education, health, finances for our children eventually. We worry about that, them supporting their family. And those things are good, but they're not the things that we have to be concerned about the most. Here's what you and I have to be concerned about the most from the time our children are young. We have to be concerned about making sure they know how to strap on the armor of God that follows that verse in verse 12 of Ephesians 6 every day of their life. And when they are young, we have to teach them what that means and show them. We don't want to send them out in the world like David when Saul offered his armor and he hadn't tested it. You see, that story wasn't that Saul's armor was too big. It was that David never tested any armor. He didn't know what it was like to fight with armor. Let me tell you something, parents. From a young age, we need to realize we are sending our children out to battle. And that's going to happen, by the way, whether your kid is homeschooled, private schooled, or public school. They go to war every day. Satan is going to stalk them. What are you doing to prepare them for the war? Do they have a shield of faith? Do they have a helmet of salvation? Are their feet shod with the preparation of the gospel? Do they know how to use the sword of the Spirit? Are they equipped? Because they are going into the battlefield, and it's our job as parents. It's not my job as the preacher. And it's not Andrew and Jason's job as the preacher. It's not the Bible class teacher's job in the high school class, whoever may be rotated through that until they die or quit. Because we know that's how it happens with the high school kids. Nobody likes y'all, by the way. We'll talk about that later. It's not their job. It's mom and dad's job. And you need to remember that that's the enemy. And you secondly, not only remember that that's the enemy, but you need to remember the goal. What is the goal? I got a lot of goals for my kids, by the way. I got goals for them in education. I want them to get an education to be able to take care of their family. I want them to find a spouse so that they can marry and leave home. That's the most important thing. But also have grandkids. I'd really like grandkids. By the way, all my kids are failing in that area. Not the grandkids part. Not even finding a date. Any single girls 19 to 45. I got a 21-year-old son. If you're interested, come find me. I want to make sure that they're smart. Not that they're rich, but they're stable. They got a good career. You know, none of that matters if they don't make it to heaven. Our children are going to face all kinds of obstacles as young children, as teenagers, as young adults, as parents. They're going to face all kinds of obstacles. And the message that we need to preach to them and teach to them constantly is no matter what obstacle you come into in your life, God is always going to be the answer. Always. Didn't the Father in Luke 15 do that? Did you ever think about that? The Father in Luke 15 does that. Well, where is that? Well, first off, the application is that heaven rejoices when the lost son returns. But I want you to notice that the Father in the story taught his son about the only thing that mattered. When that son hit rock bottom, what was the solution? Go home. The Father will take care of you. The Father, there in verses 17 through 19 of Luke 15, he comes to his senses. And what did he say? How many of my father's servants have bread, and here I perish with hunger? I will arise and I will go to him and say, what? Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I have sinned against heaven and before you. Who taught him that? It wasn't the pigs. It wasn't the friends who had already rejected him because he was out of his inheritance money. It was his father that taught him about sin and about what that meant. And that confession is based on the education he received prior to ever asking for his inheritance. That was already ingrained in him. Parents, there are going to be some rough days. Your kids are going to disappoint you. You're going to cry tears of joy. And that applies to any parent of any age. That is going to happen. The relativity and the depth of that disappointment may change, but every child at some point disappoints his parent. And not just because he brings home a bad report card, but every child at some point is going to do something that spiritually threatens to bankrupt them. And what's going to bring them back? And what's going to bring you back to focus on what's important? The goal is heaven. You know why that's important? Because when your kids disappoint you, it's not about your pride, and it's not about how people will think, and it's not about the embarrassment or the humiliation because of what they've done. All that matters is fixing the situation. And what I mean by that is helping them find restoration through God, through Jesus Christ, because heaven is the goal. And we are so concerned with how to teach our kids to get good grades or throw the right kind of pass block or throw a curveball or all the things, or sing the perfect pitch, the perfect note, and make all state and all these kind of things. We're concerned about all of that when at the end of the day, none of that's going to matter if they don't go to heaven. Not one part of it. In fact, the reality is some of those things we make such a goal that they take away from what our real mission is. I've done this about 25 years now. And I could list off for you the young people I know that are smart, that are athletic, that have been deemed successful in every area of their life except for their faith. And all of those things were a priority, but not their faith. And it wasn't a priority for those young people that grew up because it wasn't a priority for their parents. Paul says that we're to raise them in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. That's our job. Dads, specifically. Third, when your child walks away, remember to pray daily. One of my favorite books is Job. And I'm reminded of how the book starts off and it talks about his family. In Job 1 and verse 5, it's so interesting because it says, when the days of their feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them and rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did continually. Job was a priest for his family continually, praying over them, offering sacrifices for them. We're told in places like 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 17, to pray without ceasing. Certainly that would include prayers to our children, for our children. Philippians 4, 6 through 7 tells us not to be anxious for anything, but through prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. If you're worried about your children, Paul says the answer to that is the same answer for any of your worries. Pray. Parents, did you pray for your kids today? And not just to protect them at school, not just to protect them from COVID. Did you pray about their future? Did you pray about their faith? Did you pray about the way that they will live their life? Did you pray that God would grant them mercy if possible? One of my favorite passages is Ephesians 3 and verse 20, where it says that God is able to do far more abundantly than we can ask or think. Look, I know I'm going to fall short as a parent. I already have lots of times. But I pray daily for God to fill in those gaps. It always amazes me in Luke 15 and verse 20, and I've said this all week, that son pops his head above the horizon and his dad sees him and runs to him, tackles him, kisses him. Let me ask you a question. If that father stood there every day looking across the horizon for the son to come home, do you think he prayed for the son to come home? I think every moment he looked out that front door, he was praying for the son to come home. Over 20 years ago, I was just a young preacher in my early 20s. Truthfully, didn't know what I was doing. But there was a young kid that had grown up there. And he had come and he had talked to me several times about his involvement with drugs. And he was finally on a path to sobriety. He had been sober for several months when he got arrested. They had one of these big roundups in the county we lived in. Bounty hunters came to his home, put him in handcuffs, threw him in the back of their truck in front of his parents. He was facing 12 years of prison for reselling prescription drugs. We would ride to the courthouse together. It was about a 20-minute drive. He and I, his parents would follow, and we'd talk a lot. He told me one time, one of those drives, he said, Terry, do you know how many times I should have died? He said, the stuff I've done, and he would tell stories of things that he had done, total his car so bad that he couldn't even recognize it. So high that he would have to crawl away from the car if he wrecked it, more than one wreck. And he said, one night, though, I came home extremely late. I'd been out doing things I should not have survived. He said, it's very early in the morning. I walk through the dark house. I cross to my door, which is right next to my parents' door. Their door is open. And I look in their room, and there's my mom on her knees at the foot of the bed praying. And he said, I can tell you the only reason I'm alive is because every night I was gone, my mom knew where I was at and what I was doing, and she prayed constantly to keep me alive. Pray for your children that they are safe, that they draw closer to God, that they have wisdom, that they will put their trust in God, that when they suffer, when they make bad choices, pray that God will allow godly sorrow to touch their hearts and to change them. Pray for your kids. And fourth, remember the hope. There's no doubt this father had hope. That's why he runs out to meet him, because he's had hope the entire time that his son would come home. And I don't know how long that was, whether it was months or years, but I do know he never quit hoping. If you're here this evening with a prodigal son or daughter of your own, just want to tell you, do not lose hope. Don't lose hope. And don't sit back in sorrow and remorse and wonder what you could have done differently. And let me tell you why. That is a futile exercise to ask yourself, what could I do differently? It is a futile exercise that is nothing more than a guessing game at best. And what it is Satan's way of paralyzing you in the moment from doing anything you can do now. Don't do that. Because if you sit back wringing your hands in self-pity and regret over a child who's outside your reach, you will be so distracted by that, you are going to also not reach out to the ones who are still within your reach. So that's what Satan wants. He wants you to not affect those around you. And that doesn't mean that there are other children or other family members even. It may be other children here that you know that you can reach that their parents can't. Don't let the self-pity cause you to not be able to do the other responsibilities you can do. Jesus said that no one puts his hand to the plow and looks back as fit for the kingdom. Don't look back. Instead, be like in Philippians 3, where we push forward, forgetting what lies behind. Arthur Barbara Johnson described grieving over her unrepentant son. And she said in her book that after she had done everything she could do to save him, she imagined in her mind and prayed that she carried him up to the steps to the throne of God, where she laid him in God's arms and turned around and walked away. I will tell you, sometimes when we have done all that we can, that is all that there is left to do. Put your child in the Lord's hands and hope in Him. And focus on what we can do. And then finally, remember to always celebrate the return. The whole point of this entire section of Luke 15 was that the Pharisees could not celebrate when sinners were restored. They would not even allow sinners to be restored. They just always looked down upon them as sinners. And in every story Jesus told, the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son, all three of those stories, in every one of those sections, verses 6 and 7, verse 9 and 10, and verse 32, all three of those passages in Luke 15 focus on one thing: celebration. Celebration over the return of the lost. Here's the reality about lost children. Often with prodigal sons and prodigal daughters, there is more than one return. And it is tempting, if we're not careful, to become callous to that, to allow that to cause us to look at them differently. Don't ever do that. Don't ever do that. Don't ever look down upon somebody who's returned, whether it's the first time or the 30th time or the 60th time. You celebrate every single return every time. Every single one of them. Because the angels in heaven are celebrating their return. And if the angels are celebrating their return, we should be too. And by the way, not just parents, all of us. All of us should celebrate the return. Because I want to make sure you get the point of what we studied all week long was to lead up to the end of chapter 15 that condemns the older brother for not celebrating. Let's not let that be us. Let me just tell you, if you're here and you're currently struggling with a wayward child, I have a heavy heart for you tonight. And I hope these just simple things I've shared may encourage you, but I want you to notice what I didn't say. There is no step-by-step easy formula to make all of this go back to normal. I wish there was. I wish I could come up and say, if you'll do these three things in every case, in every instance, your wayward child will return. I wish I could give you that lesson, but I can't. The reality is there's no way to make that happen with some set of magical words or magical steps. The reality is I can't promise you that your child will return. I can tell you to do everything you can to direct them towards heaven. And when you have done all of that, confidently leave them in the hands of the Lord. Because He will take care of you. And I can promise you this, that if you're here and you are lost tonight, that you are that wayward child, I can promise you this, heaven will celebrate tonight if you will come back. And we will too, won't we? We will too. If you're the younger brother who's lost, who's left, who's rebelled against the Father, and you've not come back home, confessing your sin and your dependence on the Father and wanting to be treated as His servant, if you've not done that, we just simply want to beg you one last time this week to do that now. Come home. Come back to the Father through the Son. If you've not put on Christ, do that tonight. Be obedient and put on Jesus through the waters of baptism. We can help you do that. Why not come while we stand, while we sing this?